All right, so we're working on assignment number 22 from our Google Classroom. We're on page 771. Today's focus is measuring area, and we're continuing with our essential goal or essential question of how perimeter and area are related to each other. How are they the same and how are they different? So just a reminder, area is the number of square units needed to cover a figure without overlapping. So if you don't have it already, it should be in your vocabulary notebook. The area is the number of square units needed to cover a figure. It's different from perimeter because the perimeter, so area says how many squares fill up the inside, whereas perimeter just gives us the distance around the outside of a shape or figure. All right. Sometimes you can need to count the number of half square units covered by the figure. So if I was to look at figures like this, the shaded parts would be half of a square. Each of these is half of a square unit. So example number 1. In art class, Haley drew the figure at the right on grid paper. What is the area of the figure that Haley drew? We're going to count the number of whole squares first. So looking over here, I'm going to put a number in each whole square. I'd like you to number yours, and we'll check back with how many whole square numbers there are. So you can begin. Stop the video and check back. 1. Okay, so I counted up my squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I have 14 whole squares. So I'm going to write that in over here. There are 14 whole squares. Now it says to count the number of half squares. So looking over here, here is a half square and here is a half square. So there are 2 half squares. 2 halves equal 1 whole. If I put those together, they could make a whole square. So looking at my problem, I have 14 whole squares and 2 half squares. So 14 plus 1 whole square equals 15 squares total. So the area is 15 square units. All I did was I put this one together with this one to get one more square. All right, turn to the next page. Sometimes the units on drawings or figures represent another unit of measurement. Raphael created the geoboard figure at the right to represent a design he created. 1 square unit on the geoboard represents 1 square centimeter on the design. What is the area of the design? If you would like, you could get a geoboard and make this design. You can stop the video and make it. Okay, so I struggled to make this design. If you don't make yours, no problem, you don't need it. But I can look at the geoboard and I can look at the squares that are made up by the corners. I'm going to draw these squares in on my picture in my book. So looking at the close-up copy of my book, I can go ahead and draw in full squares. Here's 1 square. This is another square. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Then I can identify my half squares. Remember, 2 halves make 1 whole. So I like to draw arrows to match them up. So here's a half and here's a half. I'm going to draw an arrow. That's 1, and I'll just make a tally. Here's a half and here's a half. That's another. Here's a half and here's a half. That's a third. And here's a half and here's a half. That's a fourth. So I had 8 halves, and when I combined them together, they made 4 whole pieces. So let's count them up. So first we're supposed to count up the number of whole squares, which we counted up, and I numbered them, and I had 8 whole squares. I'm going to write that in. Then count the number of half squares. There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 half squares. 8 half squares. 8 halves equal 4 wholes. And that's what we counted up, and that I made the tallies for. So we're going to add 8 whole squares plus 8 half squares, which are equal to 4 whole squares. 8 plus 4, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I have 12 whole squares. So the area is 12 square units. The area of the design is 12 square centimeters. We don't want to forget that they told us that these units are centimeters. Let's do some guided practice together. A figure is covered by 10 whole squares and some half squares. If the area is 12 square units, how many half squares are there? Explain. So I know that there were 10 whole squares. I'm going to take away the 10 whole squares from 12. 12 minus 10 equals 2. So there's 10 squares, so there's 2 whole squares left. But the rest is half squares. So if I have 2 squares and they are halves, how many halves do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's just to answer this silly rubber band question. Okay, find the area of each figure. Here I have a figure. I'd like for you to stop the video and count up your whole squares and also your half squares, and then write down your problem. Make sure you show your work along the way. Okay, so here's what I have so far. I have 1, 2, 3 whole squares, so I wrote that down. And I have 1, 2, 3 half squares. Now I know that these 2 halves, they make 1 whole. So I'm going to count it as 1, 1, 2, 3, 4 wholes and 1 half. So that puts me at 4 1/2 square units. Let's look at the next one together. I'm going to draw my squares in. Here's 1 square, 2 squares, 3 squares, 4 squares, and then I have 2 halves. So I write down 4 wholes and 1, 2, 2 halves. I know that 1/2 plus 1/2, this gives me 1 whole. So I'm going to add 4 plus 1 equals 5 square units. Let's read our directions for the next couple practice problems. All right, find the area of each figure. You're going to count them up. Make sure you label your whole squares and then show arrows to which half squares you're combining together to give me your total area. So let's do this one together so you see what I mean. I want you to label the whole squares. 1, 2, 3, 4. Draw arrows to your halves that you are combining. These two, 1/2 plus 1/2 makes a whole, so I'm going to call it whole number 5. And 1/2 and 1/2, I'm going to draw arrows, and this makes it number 6. So this is, the area is 6 square units. Okay, I'd like you to do the same thing. Draw your squares, label them, and then draw arrows to your halves that will connect to each other. Down here, find the area of each shaded region if 1 square unit represents 1 square inch. So they're saying that all of these are square inches, and they have that labeled for you, so you don't need to worry about it. But on a test, you'd need to label square inches, and all you're doing is you're finding out how many complete squares are shaded. Don't be confused, because notice parts of it are not shaded. So only find the shaded amount. On the back, you have some word problems to work through. I'd like you to do the best you can. For your hot problems, use the grid to draw two different figures that have the same area. That's not too difficult. You can go back and look at the guided practice from yesterday. For number 14, a rectangular room is 10 units wide by 14 units long. Find the area and perimeter of the room. Located, I'd like for you to draw a picture. For which you will need some graph paper. And I will have that available for you. Miss Hayden can give that to you. All right, and finally, how is the operation of addition related to finding area? I'd like you to skip this problem. All right, go ahead and answer your problems, and these are on Kia as well.